In this PowerPoint, we're going to look at the skeleton and muscles. Um, this is a reasonably long chapter with quite a few learning objectives. First of all, you need to know about all the different parts of the skeleton, and we'll be dividing that up into two major sections, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton, and we'll be looking at the structure of each of those and the function of all the different parts of them. Then we'll be looking at bone growth and development and how that happens. We'll also be looking at the different types of joints that you have in your body and looking at the role of cartilage, ligaments, and tendons in those joints. Then we'll look at arthritis and talk about the causes and effects and possible prevention and treatment. And then we'll talk about how muscles work in pairs at the end of the chapter. Firstly, the musculoskeletal system, meaning the muscles and skeleton working together, is controlled by our nervous system, which will form part of a later chapter. And there are two types of musculoskeletal system. Either you can have your skeleton on the outside of the body, and it's called an exoskeleton, or you can have it on the inside of the body, and it's called an endoskeleton. We came across the term exoskeleton before when we were talking about chitin, and chitin came up in our nutrients chapter, and it was as part of the beetle's exoskeleton, so the skeleton on the outside. Humans, of course, have our skeleton on the inside, so it's called an endoskeleton. So what does the skeleton do for us? Here it's divided up into four different functions. In reality, the first one there, support and shape, could be separated out into two if you needed to do that. So the skeleton provides support, it holds us upright. Without it, we'd be a puddle of jelly on the floor. And it also gives us our shape in that if you have long bones, you'll be tall. If you haven't got long bones, you'll be short. Protection then. Different parts of the skeleton protect different soft internal organs, like your skull protecting your brain or your rib cage protecting your heart and lungs. Then movement. The bones are pulled on by muscles to keep our body moving. And then blood cell production, which is one you might not necessarily think of, but we did mention this when we were doing our circulation system. Our bone marrow makes our blood cells, the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets, which are tiny fragments of the other blood cells. There's a little YouTube video you can watch on that explaining the functions of the skeleton. Now, the skeleton then is divided up into two major regions. You'll see on this slide here that I have some of them highlighted in red. And let's just trace where those few things are. So we have our skull in here, then we move down and we have our breastbone down here. We have our ribs all around here, spine down to the coccyx down at the bottom. Now, what you might notice about all of that is that it's right down along the middle of the skeleton, and that's why it is called, if it's down along that central axis, that's why it's called the axial skeleton. Okay, all the other bits are added on, if you like, to that central axis, and they're called the appendicular skeleton. It comes from the word appendix. I don't know if you've ever done a major research project, but if you have, you might have put appendices or an appendix at the end of it to just explain some of your references, where they came from and things like that. The appendix there is an add-on, rather like our own appendix in the digestive system. So the appendicular skeleton consists of all the parts that are added on to that central axis. So again, the central axis has the skull, down into the breastbone and the vertebrae, breastbone at the front, vertebrae at the back, ribs connecting those two, the breastbone back to the vertebrae. Down at the very bottom as well, the coccyx deserves special mention down at the very bottom of the spine. So all of those come together to make your axial skeleton. Then what are in the additions? Well, In the additions, we have our pelvic girdle, which is down here, our pelvic girdle. And we have our pectoral girdle, which is up here at the top in the shoulders. And then we have the limbs coming out of them. So we have our arms and we have our legs down there. So all of those make up our skeleton. So let's just zero in for a sec on the axial skeleton again. It consists of the skull, 12 pairs of ribs, sternum, and the vertebrae, which make up our vertebral column at the back. And then the appendicular, we have the pectoral girdle, which, as I said, is up here around the top of your shoulders. And then the pelvic girdle, which is down here around your hips, and the attached limbs. And by limbs, we mean the legs that are attached to your pelvic and the arms that are attached to your pectoral. There's a nice little YouTube video which goes into slightly more detail on that. Overall, all of this adds up to about 206 bones. Interestingly, when you're born, you have around 305 bones, but some of those tiny little bones fuse as you get bigger, and a fully grown adult then has around 206 bones. Now, let's look at our axial skeleton in more depth. So we have the skull, the ribs, the sternum, and the vertebrae. Let's look at the vertebrae first of all. So here we have at the back our spine, and it's divided up into 33 bones called vertebrae. Now those vertebrae are divided into regions. Starting at the top up here near the neck, we have our first 7 are called the cervical or cervical, depending where you're from, but cervical vertebrae. Then after those come the thoracic, and if you remember, we talked about our thoracic cavity when we were doing breathing, and those thoracic vertebrae here, there are 12 of them. And then we have our lumbar region. Now this is a region that very often gives trouble, the lumbar region. It has to support a lot of the weight of your torso, and so it's the place that quite frequently gives difficulty with bulging discs of cartilage. And then we have our sacral region down here at the bottom, and you'll notice that the sacral and into the coccyx here, they're all fused together. The lumbar, the thoracic, and the cervical vertebrae are all able to articulate or move slightly, and they have discs of cartilage in between them to allow that to happen, that little bit of movement. Now it's a limited range of movement, obviously enough, and that's what contributes to the strength that we have in our back, whereas the ones down here need to be very strong, and they've actually fused your 5 sacral vertebrae and your coccyx, which is made up of 4 fused vertebrae. Now, if you were to take what's called a transverse section, cutting across your spine, here's what it would look like. There's a view from above looking down onto it, and you'll see that in the middle, your spinal column has in the middle a neural canal, which is a hole for the spinal cord. And so those are the nerves that run from your brain down through your back to get to your lower limbs. I think you can probably imagine what would happen if this little disc of cartilage here, this blue disc of cartilage shown in a longitudinal view or view from the side of the vertebrae, if that little disc of cartilage that's in between those 2 bones there or vertebrae, if the disc of cartilage starts to bulge slightly, it has a little liquid in the inside that could just start to bulge out, you would see that it would touch off this little nerve that's going down through here, and that would be quite painful and is very common, and we call that a slipped disc. Now let's look at our rib cage then. So the main function of your rib cage is to protect the soft organs inside it. Those are the heart and lungs. It also helps in breathing or ventilation. What's it made up of? Well, it's made up of the sternum here, which is this bone down the middle at the front, and that's also called your breastbone, and then 12 pairs of ribs. So those 12 pairs of ribs, when you think about it, correspond to your thoracic vertebrae at the back. They're all attached to vertebrae in the spine, so they're all attached at the back. But then they're divided into 3 different regions depending on how attached they are at the front. So the top 7 ribs are called your true ribs, and they're attached at the front to the sternum here. So you'll see number 1 to 7 there are all attached to the sternum here. Okay, so we're down as far as here, right up to the top. Okay, then the next 3 here are not attached to the sternum, but they are attached to each other with little bits of cartilage. Okay, so the next 3 ribs are attached to each other with some cartilage, and they're called false ribs. So we had 1 to 7 up here were attached into the sternum, and they're called the true ribs. Then we have our next 3 here, so numbers 8, 9, and 10 are attached to each other by some cartilage here at the front, but not attached to the sternum, and they're called the false ribs. And then the last 2 down at the bottom are actually not attached to anything at the front. Consequently, very easy to break and give yourself a lovely punctured lung with them. And those ones there are called your floating ribs, those last 2 down at the bottom of the rib cage. As I said, they are attached at the back to the spine. You can see the attachment back here to the spine at the back of your rib cage, but they're not attached to the front, so they're called the floating ribs. So just quickly run through that again. Number 1 down to number 7 there, you'll see are all attached to the breastbone. Then 8, 9 and 10 are attached to each other, and 11 and 12 don't seem to be attached to anything. So that's the description of your rib cage. Quick learning check there. At this stage you should hopefully be able to give some functions of the skeleton, name the 2 regions, describe what the axial skeleton is composed of and the appendicular, and then go into a little bit more detail about the vertebrae. Now, what about your appendicular skeleton then? As I said, it comes from the word appendix or add-on. So it consists of the pectoral girdle, your pecs up there around your shoulders, the pelvic girdle, your pelvis down around the hips, and then the associated limbs, and by limbs we mean your arms and legs. So the pectoral girdle then connects the spine to the arms. It contains a collarbone or clavicle, and that's the bone that kind of sticks out at the front of your body. A very sore one if you break it. Then you have your shoulder blade, which is at the back. So just highlight those again. So here's your clavicle, which is at the front, and then your shoulder blade, which is this big triangular one at the back. Looks like a triangular plate at the back. That's your scapula. And then you have your arm, which is composed of this big bone up at the top called the humerus, or your funny bone, and then 2 bones down at the bottom, the radius and the ulna. The radius there being attached down to your thumb, and then the ulna being the thinner bone at the back. Okay, so that's your pectoral girdle. On then to your pelvic girdle, and the pelvis is down around the hips. So your pelvic girdle connects the spine to the hips and legs. You have 2 halves here of your hip. They are attached to the sacrum of the spine in the middle. And then your leg is made up of your femur, which is the longest and heaviest bone in the body, also called your thigh bone. And then your tibia, which is this sturdy bone at the front of the leg, which carries all the weight. And then your fibula, which is the one at the back. Sorry, the labeling isn't great on that. So there's your tibia, and your fibula is the one here at the back, which doesn't carry any weight. And then worth a mention is your kneecap there, or your patella, which covers over the knee joint. So that's your appendicular skeleton. Learning check on that. Should be able to tell us what the pectoral girdle is, the pelvic girdle. And now we're moving on to look at our tarsals and metatarsals in a little while. You should also be able to locate the ulna, humerus, femur, patella and clavicle at this stage. Now, the actual structure of the bone then, and now we're getting into kind of the higher level stuff, I suppose. So we look at the long bones. So an example of this would be your femur. And we're going to talk about the external structure first, and then the internal structure. So here we're looking at the external view. And in our external view, we can see, we can see that we have a long shaft of the bone, and that's called the diaphysis. And then we have two little bits at the end, or add-ons, called epiphysis. Dia, by the way, means through, and physis means growth. And epi means onto, or on top, or added. For instance, epitaph means onto tomb. Anyway, we're not here for a Greek lesson. So we have the epiphysis at both ends, and then we have the diaphysis, which is the long shaft of the bone. Then the bones are covered in a membrane on the outside here called the periosteum, and that has the blood vessels and the nerves for the bone. Now that's quite important, because if ever you have damaged ligaments versus damaged bones, you'll know that the bones heal a bit faster because they have a good blood supply to them, whereas ligaments are dependent actually on nutrients diffusing into them from nearby bone, and so they take quite a bit longer to heal. The cartilage then covering over the ends of these long bones has two functions. It reduces the friction of bone rubbing on bone, and it also acts as a shock absorber. For instance, when you're running, every time your leg plants on the ground, a shock travels up through all of the bones, and the cartilage helps to minimize that shock, as do your fancy runners. Now, what about the internal structure then? Well, in the internal structure, the main things we have to think about are the three different types of region: the compact bone, the spongy bone, and the medullary cavity. Now, the compact bone, even though it's labelled here as being up at the top, there's actually only a very thin layer of compact bone around the top of the bone, or the epiphysis. Mainly the compact bone, I'll just highlight, mainly the compact bone is down along the shaft of the bone in this region here. You see the orangey colour there. That is your compact bone, and the same on the other side. So that's all your compact bone. And then inside that, at the epiphysis, or at the top of the bone, you have spongy bone. So here's our spongy bone up at the top, which is shown as red in this diagram, and spongy bone down at the bottom. And then you have a hole in the middle of the bone called the medullary cavity. Now, what is this compact bone that I was talking of? So mostly found in the diaphysis, or the shaft of the bone, but also in a little layer around the epiphysis at the top and the bottom ends of the bone. It has living cells in it, and they're in a matrix of calcium and a protein called collagen. It's very densely packed, and the bone cells there are getting nutrients from the blood vessels, and you'll also have some nerve fibres running through it. You don't need to know this diagram over here on the right. What about your spongy bone then? Well, your spongy bone is similar enough in structure to the compact bone, except that, as you might expect from the term spongy bone, it has holes in it. So it has a network of tiny bony bars separated by different sized little holes or spaces. The spaces then are filled up with bone marrow. So red bone marrow in those spaces makes your blood cells, and that was one of the functions we listed for our skeleton, was to make bone cells. And this spongy bone is mostly found in the two ends, as we mentioned earlier. Moving on then to the cavity, the medullary cavity. A cavity means a hole, and that hole in the middle of the bone has some bone marrow in it. When you're young, that bone marrow is primarily red bone marrow, and that's a really active bone marrow in making bone cells. In the adult body, it has become inactive, and it's called yellow bone marrow at that stage. All it really does is store fat. However, if the body has a requirement to increase blood formation, then that yellow marrow can be changed to red marrow, and then it will form blood cells. So quick learning check on that. I'll leave you to peruse those yourself as you go through. Now the next section is about bone growth and development. So you need to know the theory, but not really the diagrams in this. So in humans and other animals, the skeleton of the embryo is first made of cartilage, and then it's replaced by bone while we're still in the womb. So that all happens really early in the development in mammals when the baby's in the womb. Around 8 weeks or so it starts to happen. Up until then, there isn't any bone, it's just collagen. Bone forming cells called osteoblasts produce collagen first of all, and then a matrix of hard calcium phosphate and collagen forms, and the osteoblasts, those little bone forming cells, become trapped and become actual bone cells eventually. Now, as you're getting bigger then, as the body grows, the bone increases in length because it has a place called a growth plate in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. And in that growth plate, your cartilage is constantly being turned into bone or ossified. And as it does, that bony region here is getting wider and wider, and so the bone is getting longer and longer. Here's a kind of a summary diagram of that. As I said, you don't need to know that diagram. Right, how come then our bones don't get really heavy if the bone is constantly being made here and constantly growing? Well, even though bone is being made, bone is also being digested, for want of a better word, on the inside of your bone shaft. So bone is constantly being dissolved or digested and replaced. In fact, your full bone will be replaced about 10 times in your lifetime. So the bone is being removed from this area here on the inside of your long shaft or diaphysis of the bone, and bone is then being formed on the outside. So the bones overall are getting thicker, but the hole in the middle, the cavity, is getting bigger. And the overall effect of that is that even though the bone gets larger, longer and thicker, it doesn't get heavier. Just to mention as well that there are two different types of cell involved in this process. There's the osteoclasts that do the digesting of the bone that line the cavity in here. And when they do digest that bone, they release the calcium into the blood. And then the osteoblasts are the bone forming cells, and they're the ones that form the bone on the outside of the bone there. And there's a nice YouTube clip on that if you'd like to have a look at it. Now that brings us to the end of, I suppose, the higher level or harder stuff. So there's a quick learning check on that. And now we get to look at the joints. So a joint is where two bones meet in the body, and the function of the joints is to allow us to move. The joint is where the muscles and the bones interact with each other in order to bring about movement. Now there are three different types of joint. You have your immovable, can't be moved at all, they're fixed joints, your slightly movable joints, and then your freely movable joints, although technically that's a misnomer. The joints are not completely freely movable. So here are some of the locations. So the main one that you need to know for the immovable is in your skull. And you see they're called fused joints in the skull, there and there. When you are first born, you have many more bones in your skull, but they grow towards each other and fuse gradually, and that's why it's terribly important not to drop a baby on their heads. Very important not to drop babies in general, I should say, but in particular not on their heads, because these bones have not fused yet and are therefore not as good at protecting the fragile little brain inside. Then to move on to the partially movable. So two types of partially movable joint. We have gliding joints, and you find those in your wrist and also in your ankle. So in your wrist and your ankle you have gliding joints where the bones can kind of slide across each other. I guess that's your keyword for your partially movable or gliding joint. And then another partially movable joint that you have is the pivot joint, and the pivot joint is right in here, which allows you to move your skull up and down and from left to right. And that pivot joint again is a slightly movable joint. And then finally we come to our freely movable joints over here, and freely movable are called synovial joints. And the two main types that you need to know for those are, first of all, the hinge joint, and we have a hinge joint here in our elbow and also a hinge joint in our knee. And the hinge joint allow movement in one plane only, so 180-degree movement that you have in your knee and also in your elbow, which you can move your arm up and down, but you can't really move it at the elbow from left to right. Whereas the other type of freely movable joint is called a ball and socket joint, and you have one of those down here at your hip and also up here at your shoulder, and those joints allow you supposedly 360-degree movement. Obviously it's not quite 360 degrees, but you can move it in the X, Y and Z plane of movement. So that's why they are called freely movable. So let's focus in on some examples of those joints and we'll fly through these. So your immovable joints, I've already mentioned, are in the skull here. And another place that you'd find those would be in your pelvic girdle, where you need a good deal of strength there, what give you the strength to support the upper body. Then you're partially movable. Here's an example there in the wrist, the gliding joint in the wrist. And in these, the bones slide over each other. It's an X-ray image of a partially movable joint. And then the freely movable joints, your ball and socket and your hinge joint. So a picture of a ball and socket joint. Example would be your shoulder and your hips. This here shows your hip. There you'd see the ball of the hip, and here you see the socket of the hip. So that ball is up at the top of your femur bone. This also shows you the little cartilage that we mentioned earlier, which is around the end of the bone, or the epiphysis there of the femur. And in between the two layers of cartilage there's some synovial fluid, and that synovial fluid also does some shock absorption when you are running. There's your shoulder, which is another ball and socket joint. Very, very painful if you have a problem where you dislocate that shoulder frequently. Not uncommon in the early teenage years, unfortunately. And then the hinge joint. Here's a hinge joint in your knee, and the hinge joint, as we said, will allow movement in one plane only. So you can move down the leg or you can move up the leg like this, but you can't at the knee move it to the left and right. There's some X-ray imagery of your hinge joints. There's your knee. Okay, the bones of the hand and the wrist then. So our limbs are what are called pentadactyl, meaning they have 5 projections at the end of them, and they basically run on the same plan, the leg and the foot and the hand. So you have a collection here of carpals in your hand. You have 7 of those, and in your toes you have 8. Then you have your metacarpals, which are, first of all, you have your metacarpals here, and those are going out in the palm of your hand. And then that brings us to the fingers. So you see the fingers are starting from here. And in the fingers, each finger is made up of 3 parts. So you have your proximal phalanges, your middle phalanges, or medial, and then you have your distal phalanges. Those words are often used actually in biology. Proximal to mean near, so they're nearer the business end of things, in this case nearer the wrist. And then the distal is generally to mean further away. So the distal would be the extremities usually, or further away from the important parts. If you were looking at the toes, again you have phalanges, but you would be calling them, these bones here, the tarsals and the metatarsals. I think it was maybe David Beckham who made the metatarsals very famous when he broke one of them and was out of action for quite some time. So how do these joints work then? Well, first of all, the bones are connected to each other by ligaments, and those ligaments are reasonably elastic, and they allow a certain amount of movement, but they stop over extension of the joint. The bones can't move on their own, they need the muscles to make them move. So the muscles are connected then to the bones by non-elastic fibres called tendons. So you see lovely accolades there. So that's joined onto your calf muscle, and when your calf muscle contracts, it pulls via this tendon on your lower foot. Now let's zero in here on our arm and look at how it works. Well, muscles can only get shorter. They can contract, so the fibres get shorter. And when they do, they pull on the bone that they're attached to, and that's what causes movement. The opposite of contracting is to relax. So generally our muscles work in pairs, and when one of them is contracting, the other is relaxing. Let's have a look at that in a little bit more depth. So here's your forearm, and say you want to rise the forearm. What do you need to do? Have a think about that for a minute first. So what's going to happen here is the biceps that's at the front of your arm is going to contract or get shorter. And if it gets shorter, it will pull on the lower arm here, and the lower arm will be pulled upwards. Meanwhile, this triceps is lengthened at the back. So there's your biceps contracting, and that's forcing your triceps to relax, to straighten out, and the bone is pulled upwards. Now, what's going to happen then when you want to lower the arm? What do you think is going to happen? I bet you got this correct. Your triceps here contracts, so it gets shorter. And if it gets shorter, it's pulling on this bit here of the bone and pulling it downwards, and that's forcing your biceps to relax, and it's opening out the joint, the the elbow joint. So watch the muscles again. Triceps contracting, biceps contracting, triceps contracting, biceps contracting, triceps contracting. That's probably enough of that. So we call these pairs of muscles that work to open and close a joint antagonistic muscles because they're a pair that work against each other effectively or in opposite directions. And our example that we just looked at there was the biceps and triceps. The biceps contracts to raise the arm, and then the triceps contracts to lower the arm. And there's a YouTube video of that that you can watch as well. It's a funny one. Now, the final thing we're going to look at is a disorder of your musculoskeletal system. And the disorder that we're going to look at is arthritis. Now, arthritis is a very painful disorder. It can have two possible causes. Either it can be a rheumatoid condition, which is caused by a disease. It's an autoimmune disease, so your immune system is effectively attacking the joints of your own body. Or it can be caused by simple wear and tear, and that's called osteoarthritis, that second type, which is a very common one in runners or people who've maybe played a couple of different sports competitively for a long time. Your intercounty GAA players, if they have a long and illustrious career, can expect to have a little bit of osteoarthritis at the end of it. So here's a picture of some rheumatoid arthritis. So you can see that the cartilage there is being replaced by bone, and there's a very painful swelling going on of the joint here. And then in osteoarthritis, you can see that the cartilage is just wearing down. And as the cartilage wears down, you have less absorption of friction, less reduction of friction, and less absorption of shock there. So you'll get pain in the joints. How do you prevent it? Well, it depends on which type you're talking about. If you're talking about the osteoarthritis, there's no real prevention of the rheumatoid, but if you're talking about the osteoarthritis, selecting good footwear and replacing your footwear very often. You can get your activity trackers now. If you're signed up for, say, even Map My Run or Runtastic or any of those apps, you can actually tell them when you've bought new runners, and then they will track your mileage and send you a little reminder when you're supposed to get new runners again, based on the model of your runner. Of course, they're also collecting data for marketing purposes. But anyway, so wearing good footwear when you're running, maybe not doing too much road running, not putting the bones and joints under excessive stress during exercise, which might mean doing a lot of your running on grass rather than on the road if it is possible. Treating the condition then, taking anti-inflammatories or aspirin, and in severe cases when there's a lot of damage done, you may have to replace the joint. For instance, you would see some runners getting knee and hip replacements if they've done several marathons. So that brings us to the end of our musculoskeletal system. I hope you've enjoyed it.